Next talk is from Chad Carlson. His talk is titled Editorial Workflows, Get Them Here. So you know it's serious. If you have questions, as usual, for Chad, put them in the Discord. I'm sure he'll be there to answer them even while his talk is going on. That's the beauty of this virtual conference hosted on Discord. So, Chad, please take it away.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. Hi, everyone. My name is Chad Carlson, and I am a DevRel engineer from Platform.sh. And title of my talk is going to be Editorial Workflows. Get them here. Thank you all for coming. The problem that I became interested in that I wanted to focus on for my talk is how non-developers can adapt to the headless CMS model. The more that I've worked with Strapi and some of the other options out there, and just the broader topic of what happens when we go decoupled and headless, is that there is a real, maybe a hurdle that happens for editorial teams when they get introduced to something like Strapi. Nothing against Strapi at all, obviously, but they're used to a certain set of tools when they're working with something like a Drupal or a WordPress. That's why you see a lot of sites that are going decoupled just ingesting that information in the first place from some of these legacy CMSs, because editorial teams, editors, and authors are really used to using these frameworks. But even when they do, it's going to be a Strapi case or WordPress or Drupal, there are things that they're losing. They're losing some of the review process that they're used to working with. They are also potentially losing the live preview aspects that you're going to get built in with something like Drupal or WordPress. And in many cases, like on Platform.sh, when they are being set up on an environment that kind of expects read-only access to the file system to get the kind of repeatable builds that we would want for a strong production Strapi installation, they're not going to be able to make changes to the API in the same way that they might used to be doing. If I'm in a Drupal installation, decoupled or otherwise, I may be able to add new pieces of content, but I could very well add a new collection content type in Drupal, the equivalent for, say, an event. And we'll see in a moment that when we do something like this on Platform.sh, it's not always ideal to continue to allow write access to the file system when we want to keep some of these properties of repeatable builds that we might want as developers on the other side of this that doesn't have to do with editorial teams. And so that's a lot of what this talk is about, is how can we in some ways restore the workflow that they're used to without forcing people who aren't familiar with Git from ever really touching Git. And so this talk is meant to be largely experimental. I mean, there's just some things that I've been playing with on Platform.sh that sort of try to get to the heart of this. So the first part will go into the choice to decouple in the first place and how GitOps, the sort of model that we follow at Platform and recommend, works with the content management system approach when it's decoupled. And then we're going to go and try and restore a couple of these pieces that we would have in a monolithic approach. So we'll try and get live previews down with Strapi on the back end, pulling into a development server of Gatsby on the front end. We'll also look at what are the challenges in trying to keep something like live preview, but then also allow for an author to write something, an editor to review it, and then for that content to then make it all the way to production. What does the actual publishing cycle look like? And then a smaller one, but like the example I just said, what happens if an editor wants to add an event content type, an event collection for a production instance of Strapi? No new collections in production. So how do we restore the ability for an editor to do something like that without creating a ticket for a developer? Going to move my computer screen a little bit so I can see my slides. So obviously, there's plenty of reasons that you would want to go headless. We're all quite familiar with them. We're at StrapiComp, so we're a little bit sold at least on the idea of having a separate content store with a tool that makes it really easy to build out an API for this content backend. The goals of decoupling, as far as I can tell, is really on trying to make your API as abstract as possible so that if you do end up in a position where you're no longer interested in a Gatsby front end, or if you want to add additional heads to your decoupled setup, one for mobile or for some other kind of device, that it's really easy to do that because of this consistent API in the backend. You can isolate teams to focus on the front or the back end only, and it's great. But like I said in my introduction, there are things that we need to consider if we're abandoning the monolithic approach for something like a Drupal or a WordPress. We're going to lose some of that tooling that comes out of many, many years of people working with those CMSs. We're going to lose some live preview functionality. We're going to need to rewrite it. And we are likely going to have to find a way to get around the fact that most of the changes that an editor or an author are going to want to make on the site to work with a kind of modern development workflow, at least how we see it at Platform, it's going to require us to get around the fact that they're going to have to make those changes in Git. So very, very briefly, so Platform.sh is a hosting company for one, but we're a platform as a service company. So we work with hosting your applications on all the big providers that you're already familiar with, AWS and Google Cloud and Azure. But we also provide a collection of DevOps tooling around your existing repository that allows you to do things like add a set of YAML files that provision a Node.js 12 application container based off of a line like you'll see here that's specifically for our Strapi instance. And so that means as a committed part of the repository, we can very easily make a branch, and on that branch, upgrade that to Node 14 and test how that goes for our site. And Platform takes care of provisioning each of those environments for each of the branches or pull requests that you have. And those changes can be version upgrades on languages, on the services that have a very similar configuration, or to your code itself. It just maps the branches one-to-one automatically to your repository, and everything is trackable and highly visible in Git. And so Git becomes the real huge model of our API. Git's the source of truth, and we can tie things like production data on our master branch to this same model. So if I'm branching out for some new feature off of the production branch, I'm going to not just get a replica of the code, all the infrastructure that comes with our configuration files inside a repository, but also all of our production data. So that gives you an interesting way to include some real customer data, some real data in your testing on any of these new feature branches. But there are some caveats. So if you'll see here, this is a configuration file for a Strapi application on Platform. We define Node.js 12, and we're going to use Yarn for all of our downloading dependencies and for building our application. So you see here that we have a build hook that's going to do those exact two steps to give us the final Strapi app. But then after that point, our container is going to become read-only. The idea here being that you'll see here I have all the frozen lock file flags on here for Yarn. That what is in Git, what is inside of your repository, so what's going to be inside your Yarn lock file alongside all these other pieces of configuration is this highly reproducible build image. So we really don't want a whole lot of write access at deploy time, at runtime, because we want to be able to reproduce this site on any new branch that we open. So we have it read only at runtime. And we'll see, sort of as I've outlined a little bit before, that's going to give us a little bit of a hurdle to come over. The interesting thing that we can also do on platform that's going to come into how we accomplish decoupling in the first place and then allow us to communicate between the two applications is that we can define an internal network for our project. So we can have a single repository with subdirectories for each of the apps that we're going to continue to develop. So we can have Strapi in a subdirectory and say Gatsby for the front end on another subdirectory. And then when they deploy, we have our container cluster that has within it itself an internal network that those two can communicate with each other on. So in this case, Strapi is going to serve this API that we're going to define out, and then Gatsby can communicate over, I believe I have it here, a relationship. So in the same way that we had a relationship for Strapi to our Postgres database where we're storing all of our actual content, we have another one directed towards the Strapi app container that is going to be accessible for Gatsby. Sorry about that. So, okay, we have this GitOps model. Git's the source of truth. Part of that is data flows down. It's not ever flowing up. The only way that anything can flow up is it has to be code, it has to be committed, and it has to be merged. Everything is tied to this reproducibility idea, and that's really a great system for handling code. But it's going to get into the way of these features that we want. It's going to get in the way of previews, of runtime collection writing, all these things that editorial teams are going to kind of need rewritten from their experience with a monolithic application. So one way that we've done this at Platform is we can define a mount on our file system that does continue to have write access at runtime. And so we've done that as a way to show off this exact thing where we have a Strapi backend on some development branch that we can add new collections to. The problem then is this anything contained within that mount, so this new events collection, rather than our normal articles or blog. We have this second collection called events, isn't going to get committed, so it'll never make it up to production. So how do we get the data up the tree? How do we get a new post up to production? How do we get a new content type that's going to be stuck inside one of these mounts and never actually get committed up to production? And how can we then maybe finagle into there some live preview at the same time? Does it all fit together? And so the point of my talk here is to say, yeah, kind of. Should you do it? I mean, that is completely up to you. It's been an interesting experience playing around with it. So let's look at live preview first of all. Like I said, we're going to have a Gatsby container and a Strapi container in one project. Inside that cluster, there's going to be a relationship from Strapi to Gatsby that it can pull data from the API on. The way that Gatsby allows you to enable something live preview, I'm sure you're all familiar with, is that you can enable this refresh endpoint on Gatsby. It's __ refresh that is going to allow you to ping it, and it will, in our case, rebuild that data layer through that Strapi relationship. Now, this enabling this part is going to require us to run a development Gatsby server on our cluster. So usually the way that we approach this is having a sort of development version of our cluster run on non-master environments. And so from there, we can enable the endpoint with this enable Gatsby refresh endpoint equals true environment variable. And then we add, in this case for Strapi, a lifecycle webhook to our content type, to our collection. So in this case, oh, I went too fast. So you see here inside of this snippet, we can modify our start command. So instead of it looking at the built Gatsby site that we've gotten in the post deploy hook and pulled from all of our Strapi content, it's going to run the development server. And from that development server, we can begin to build out this preview functionality between Gatsby and Strapi. So like I said, we have these callbacks set up inside of our model of the article. And so this is throughout the documentation of we can have a couple different events that we want to make sure that we track. Creation, update, and deletion of a entry inside of this article's collection. So in this case, we're going to set a configuration JSON up in our Strapi file structure that is a static website build URL. So this is straight out of the documentation. On Platform.sh, the way that we would do this is during any time after the build step, we can pull information like what is the current URL of any of the app containers. And more importantly, we can say what's the current relationship address for the Gatsby container in this case. And so from that, we can kind of build together this refresh endpoint and put it into this configuration file once it's available, and then call it inside of these lifestyle hooks. And so when we get that from that environment variable, we can begin to enable preview. So in this case, oh, I can't go full screen from there. That's odd. So in this case, we have our Gatsby site on the left that has a list of all of our articles. It's labeled blogs in this case. And then that articles collection here on the right. So from here, we have a development server for Gatsby. And then we are going to have these webhooks on the Strapi instance that we can then update the content attribute and have live preview. So this is running on platform, but it's not on our production site. So we're kind of getting away from this total reproducibility because we're having an experience on a development environment that won't ever be in production. But it's going to be one of those things that starts picking away at restoring this editorial workflow for our authors and our editors. And here we go. I can delete and then republish an article and have it refresh on that front-end Gatsby site. Oh, now it's going to restart. So the next one then is, what is the correct way to continue to allow an editor to review an article that has a preview URL now, which is great all by itself. Doesn't always necessarily follow the GitOps model, but we're starting to get around it, that we have this development server so an author can get an assignment and have credentials that are isolated to a work in progress development environment, purely for trying out and writing new posts. And as they add it, they have a preview URL that they can pass along to their editor. Okay, that's great. But at this point, built into Strapi, there's already a published attribute selected, right? I mean, this is a newer feature within Strapi of having a part of a model contain this unpublished publish characteristic. So we need to define something new that'll allow us to identify something as approved that an author doesn't have access to. And then we need to be able, again, to get this data out of a preview, review, development environment and somehow get it back onto the production environment. We can't do that through a merge, because as much as we can create new branches and pull data from production into any of those branches, and we can continue to sync from production too, we can't get it upstream. That's not how this GitOps model works. So how do we get it upstream? So the way that I started playing around with it is I created a new collection type poorly named two masters. So what this ends up becoming is a relationship attribute for every article. And so the collection itself isn't accessible by anybody but an editor. And then editors can get this new preview URL and say, yeah, this looks good. I'm done with my feedback and my nitpicks. I like how the preview looks, so I want to publish this. And they essentially just binary choice set it to master true. And then that feature is going to be kind of a filter as we extend out this after update lifecycle hook. So this is what I've been playing the most with, because it's sort of the most against our model, but the most interesting and with as many edge cases and gotchas that I can potentially foresee, but still interesting to play with. So what I ended up doing is this after update lifecycle hook is going to include a result of the update itself, and then we're going to feed it into this front end refresh call, same as always, because we're still on a development environment. But then we're going to get all the data that we sent to Gatsby. Gatsby doesn't require any data on its refresh. It's going to do that itself, but it's still going to be included in Strapi's request. So what I was playing around with, and I got working decently well, was checking for this to master attribute, trying to determine if it has indeed been approved, if a relationship has been defined between if a relation has been defined between a to master and an article. And then from there, I'm kind of just rebuilding the article and recreating it on the production environment. So, of course, this is highly simplified because in playing around with it, and as you'll see here, there's nothing in here of permissions or of anything specific for certain environments, not others. This is a purely public API that is only set to do this from any development environment. And we might want a little bit more granularity than that, and it's going to create edge cases because it's so generic. But you'll see here, I'm going to grab the image, a bunch of these required fields that I've set for an article. I'm going to grab the image for the new entry and pull from the environment some variables about the production Strapi instance. So in this case, the way I've implemented this is it's not something that will necessarily be dynamic. We want a project-wide variable that points to our production backend instance of Strapi. And so I can pull that from the environment and then build a multi-part request to post the image resource to the upload endpoint of that production instance. And then using the response from that, I'm going to get that image ID and then just recreate an article. It's the same article on my development branch that's been approved and has been looked over by our editorial team, by our editor, and it's just reposted to the production instance. Kind of messy, not great. And there are other parts to it too. As much as this may work, it's going to have edge cases, and beyond that, it's not going to result necessarily in an instant publishing of the new article. The way that Platform.sh works, especially when we're talking about this production environment, we want a full Gatsby build, not one of these development instances, development server at Gatsby. So we're still going to need to have some other additional call that's going to tell Platform to rebuild Gatsby on the production branch, because it's not going to do the same refresh that we have on these development environments. But at the very least, we can wait till the next time that something gets merged into production, and then we'll just have that as a loose publishing date. Or otherwise, we'll see in a second that we have another feature that we call source operations, where you can make like a very small edit to the code that forces a rebuild, in which case that would create a publishing event. But either way, the data has gone from this preview environment onto the production environment. Yeah, it was interesting to play with. Obviously, it has holes. It's going to have things that need to be accounted for, not just for permissions, but what happens if I want to update that same post, or what if I want to retract a post that has made its way onto production. But interesting to play with and how you would do it around our sort of GitOps workflow. So the final one is the smaller use case that I can see. Editor interested in having something new show up on the site. I know at Platform, we don't just have blogs that we're writing, but we have events like these where we're talking, and our DevRel team and marketing team are involved with. And we want some visibility on our site for that. So if we were doing it in a decoupled manner, we want editors to be able to play around with what they want in that data so that they can pass that all along to a developer and have them presented in a nice way. So again, production can't do that for Strapi. But once we've set up a development server for Gatsby on a development environment, we can kind of see the route that we're going. We could set up a development server for Strapi there too, and allow some of this runtime access to, a runtime write access to the file system in the same way that we have for Gatsby. So we can do that, but then it won't be committed, any new collection that we create, and it won't go up the tree. We can define our API subdirectory to have write access with one of these mounts. I don't think I showed you what that syntax looked like in the previous slides. But then we could use what I said before, a source operation. So it looks something like this. It exists in the same application configuration file I showed before, but in this case, it's going to use our existing CLI commands to connect to the environment that we're on in this kind of set aside build container environment. And in that container, it's going to go, I want to sync everything, and then I want to download everything that's currently on this mount that's not going to be committed. And once I have that, I'm going to stage and commit it inside this little build container. And then it will actually allow you to apply that commit to this development Strapi instance. And so, there's some workarounds that you need to do to make sure that that doesn't get written over by the subsequent deployment on that development server. But at the end of the day, you're going to have something that still has write access, but it has this new collection in this mount that actually will get committed and make its way up to production, or make its way up to another development environment that a front-end developer can start to play around with to see how that's going to actually be shown on the site. I guess I just wanted to show a quick preview of this terrible video. Anyways, it has two components to it: running the actual source operation itself, and then pushing to staging, pushing that actual commit to staging. And so, should you do it this way? I'm not sure. Probably not, but it is interesting to see that if you thought about all these edge cases long enough, you really could end up with a situation where you have some of the most efficient tools at your disposal for having a lot of assurance for repeatable builds for your production environment of both Strapi and some front-end consuming head, but that you can start to piece together with some of these lifestyle webhooks and tools like source operations on our side, and some environment-dependent development server business, for lack of a better word, some environment-dependent differences in how each of these servers run to kind of restore a lot of this editorial workflow that your teams are going to be used to working with, so that devs can be happy and they can have their own little side workflow that's specific to dealing with the front end, and that the editorial team itself can be on this other tree, completely involved in content. They don't run into each other, and hopefully not a whole lot of conflicts when they merge into production. Thank you very, very much for joining me for my talk. I hope that it was at least interesting in the little bit of experimentation we've been doing at Platform.sh with our multi-app configuration. We're going to be having a workshop later on in this week as well. But either way, thank you for coming and take care of yourselves.
I get asked this a lot, so I just want to say, Chad, thank you so much. Now I have a talk that I can send to everyone whenever they ask about, Git workflows. So let's show some love for Chad in the comments. Let's send like a clapping emoji, some hearts. It was a really, really good talk.